all things, all dharmas are not self. This is the deepest teaching in all of Buddhism. But what does it mean? And in particular, have we potentially been misinterpreting it in a certain way? There's a recent essay out by Bhikkhu Sujato, who runs the Sutta Central online forum, and as a wonderful scholar of the early material, will be discussing something that he recently argued for. There's a very famous three-part statement we find about the Dharma in its, I think, most deep formulation. We find it, for example, in the Dhammapada, where we read, "All conditions are impermanent, all conditions are suffering, all things, or dharmas, are not self. When this is seen with wisdom, one grows disillusioned with suffering. This is the path to purity." And here we have to note the important distinction between the first two of these and the third. We hear that all conditions are impermanent, all conditions are suffering, but all things, or all dharmas, are not self. That is, not self seems to have a broader scope than the first two, conditions being a narrower scope than all things, because some things, at least that's what this seems to imply, some things are not conditioned. That is, all conditioned things are impermanent. They're brought into being, they pass away. That's kind of what it means to be conditioned. All conditioned things are dukkha, or we might translate that suffering, or in some sense unsatisfactory. And why is that? Well, that is because we tend to cling to things, all of these conditioned things, and they pass away, and in their passing away, in their changing, in their altering in some way, they cause us to suffer because we cling to them and don't want them to change. But the unconditioned, then, isn't impermanent and isn't dukkha, or isn't suffering. Okay, but then what is the unconditioned? Traditionally, this is taken to be nirvana itself. Nirvana is the unconditioned. Nirvana is something that's not impermanent and not suffering, or not dukkha. So what this third verse here is saying, essentially, is that not only are all conditioned things not self, but also nirvana itself is not self, even though it's unconditioned. And this is the usual interpretation that we'll find of this third point here, that all things, including nirvana itself, are not self. In other words, that nirvana isn't some kind of super self in some sense. It's not as though nirvana is who we really are, or nirvana is something that's permanent to our essence. That's more like a kind of Upanishadic teaching, a teaching about Atman and Brahman, where we unify our Atman, our soul, with Brahman, the great universal truth of all reality. This is a picture we find in the Upanishads, which is stemming from Vedic Brahmanism at the time of the Buddha's day. The Buddha rejected that in favor of this idea of non-self. So the Buddha, at least this is the traditional understanding of this passage, is telling us that even nirvana is not self. Bhikkhu Sujato, however, has a different interpretation. Sujato is a very interesting scholar. He likes to be a little bit contrary sometimes, try to find his own take on things. But they're always interesting and I think worth a listen. So what he notes is he certainly agrees that nirvana is not self. He has no problem with that. In other words, the traditional interpretation, there's nothing wrong with the interpretation. But what he says is that we never find a claim in the suttas that nirvana is not self. It's not that the suttas disagree with that claim. It's just that it seems, at least in Sujato's understanding, that that's just sort of taken for granted. He notes that it is stated in one very late canonical text, the Parivara, which he believes was composed some 4 centuries after the Buddha's lifetime, but it's never mentioned in the suttas that nirvana is not self. And since this is never mentioned in the suttas, he doesn't think it's probably what's being pointed to in this third claim that all dharmas are non-self or not self. But then what else could this claim mean, that all dharmas or all things are non-self? Well, Bhikkhu Sujato says that there have been a number of potential suggestions by other scholars, but he doesn't find any of them particularly convincing because he doesn't find any support in the suttas for what they claim. So what Sujato's procedure here is to look for a place in the suttas that mentions dharmas in the context of them not being impermanent or not being dukkha. And he says he finds one place that at least seems to fit some of what he's looking for, one particular mention in the suttas, and this is what that particular passage says. Mendicants, whether Tathagatas arise or not, this law of nature persists, this regularity of Dharma, this invariance of Dharma. All conditions are impermanent. Whether Tathagatas arise or not, this law of nature persists, this regularity of Dharma, this invariance of Dharma. All conditions are suffering. Whether Tathagatas arise or not, this law of nature persists, this regularity of Dharma, this invariance of Dharma. All dharmas are non-self, or not self. So what does this passage show? It shows that these laws of nature, these dharmas, are regular and invariant. That is to say, that they're not impermanent. So they don't fall under the conditions that we read in the beginning of that passage at the Dhammapada. They're not impermanent. Bhikkhu Sujato also takes from that they aren't suffering either, since they're not impermanent, they're not subject to change. They're not conditioned in the ordinary sense of the word. They haven't been brought into being, they don't pass away. However, nevertheless, they are themselves not self. That is to say, we should not grasp at them or understand them to be who we really are. Now, it may seem strange that we might grasp at principles such as these, that we might take them to be who in some sense we really are, these principles that all things change, that dukkha arises through the laws of dependent origination, and so on. We might think it's strange to grasp at these principles in that way, but of course we do this all the time. That is, we identify ourselves with the Dharma as a set of ideals, a set of principles, a set of invariant kinds of assertions. We cling to them as one might cling to a raft while we're crossing a river. So, Sujato's point is that this claim that all dharmas are not self is meant to include these invariant principles among the dharmas. They aren't conditioned, they're not impermanent, they're not dukkha, but nevertheless they're also not self. They're not to be clung to as who we really are, they're not to be identified with. This is something that the Buddha, of course, very famously discussed in his simile of the raft, which I did a video about in the past. I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. That said, this claim by the Buddha that all dharmas are not self is both broad and enigmatic enough that it may be intended to apply to both of these things, all of these things, to these principles, to nirvana, indeed to anything that we can conceive of in any respect, insofar as we can conceive of it, insofar as we can give it a name, a description, it's not self. I think that perhaps is the intention here, although Bhikkhu Sujato may be getting at something more of what the Buddha was thinking about in specific. Who knows? It's difficult to say for sure. Which gets us to the question of the Dharma itself. I did an earlier video about the preeminence of the Dharma among the three Buddhist jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or if you would like to see it again. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here on the screen and down below in the show notes, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.